Hello, everyone, and good evening. I am your host, Jason Miles, and welcome to another episode of This is Revolution Podcast. If you are new to the channel, please hit like, hit subscribe, and don't forget to hit that notification bell as we're adding new shows and cross streams constantly. Also, please check out the latest video essay, Welcome to the Terror Dome, and the recap stream Pascal and I did. And if you have time, check out my article in Sublation magazine that goes with said video essay. Gets a little bit more in depth. Also, moving forward, we'll be doing a call-in Tuesday and Thursday in the Champagne Room. So if you are a patron, I try to post the number. I'll post the number for you guys right away. But you can call in, tell us what you think about the show. If you have questions, you can ask. Want to talk mess with us? You can talk mess with us. Just become a patron and you can do it. You can be part of the Champagne Room. It's as easy as going to patreon.com/BitterLakePresents, and we have packages as low as $30 for the year. You can have access to the Champagne Room. Also, I want to thank everyone that joined us last night for Beyond the Red Zone. If you guys didn't know, I was producing that show while also running to the other room I have here and being a guest on David Feldman's show, where he then asked me questions that I was not prepared for. Like, we have a whole thing we're supposed to talk about with Feldman, and he totally went a different way with it. And we ended up talking about celebrities and protest. But shout out to Marcus and Mac for holding it down for Beyond the Red Zone. It is our leftist sports show. It is the best leftist sports show on this channel. I was going to say on the internet, but I don't know if that's true. I don't know how many there are out there. But that being said, Pascal and I will be joining Anders Lee on his podcast this Friday. So let me bring in my co-host, my homie, my dog, the man of the Mau Mau Hour. He is the Pascal Robert.
Peace and greetings to the chat. Peace and greetings to the audience. Peace and greetings, Jason Miles. Jason has been doing wonderful work. He's been under the weather lately. Please, thoughts and prayers for Jason Miles. He's got a bit of a cold / nasal infection thing going.
I'm actually pretty fucked up.
He's been kind of sick.
You can tell, and unfortunately, I'm hoping it goes away by the time I have to narrate the video essay that I'm doing. So that's going to really suck if the video essay is me sounding like this. I feel like I sound like a nasally.
I'm looking forward to tonight's show.
Uh-oh.
Because I like our guest. It's going to get spicy.
Our guest, look, I think our guest is a lot of fun. I love whenever she comes on the show. I wish we had her on the show more often. She is a very busy individual. Doing all the things that it is she does. I don't even know half of the things she does. I try to find out on the internet. The internet only tells you so much. Only so much. But the internet did give me this photo.
Yes.
Of the wonderful Jen Pan. Let's introduce Jacobin host. One of my, actually, I have to say, for concise content, I actually like a lot of the stuff that Jen, of course, Paul, who was a part of the show for up until his run for office, and Ariella, they do really, really awesome work. So shout out to the Jacobin crew, and please welcome, coming all the way live from an undisclosed location somewhere in the Southwest, Jen Pan.
Good to see you guys. Been too long.
Jen, so glad you are here.
Likewise.
We want to put some hot lead onto this internet today with the topic. Jen, I just want to let you know I'm glad you're here because as a fellow person who the race reductionists don't like and really, really, really have a problem with, it's going to be interesting to see how we negotiate through this subject matter. But I'm ready to make it happen. I hope you are. How have you been, Jen? Have you been well?
I've been good. I've been good. I heard Jason laying on the compliments earlier, and I know that's because you guys are about to get me in trouble, but I'm ready for it. And I think I'm in good company. It's good to see you too, Pascal.
We're not
And
gonna.
we haven't even begun to compliment you yet.
Right, yeah. So you know things are going to get spicy.
No, definitely things are gonna get spicy for sure, for sure. So I want to really start off right out the gate because we go straight to the issues here on This is Revolution. Now, for me, as someone who studied critical race theory in law school and has researched the origins of intersectionality as a legal theory which attempts to expand suspect classification for black women under the argument that they experience a special form of discrimination from black men that black men do not realize. Do you see intersectionality as particularly a liberal project, and how do you view the origins of it as a concept from its beginning?
Right. Okay, so a few general comments about intersectionality. And I do want to go back to the origins of intersectionality eventually, and specifically, I would be interested to hear your take because I want to look at the court case that is sort of the foundation that Kimberly Crenshaw developed intersectionality from. But right off the bat, I guess I will just say that, I think that intersectionality is one of these sorts of vague and often fuzzy terms like critical race theory, which of course is related, that comes out of legal studies and the academy. And I think very often, ends up meaning something a little bit different in a popular or activist context. And I assume for, the duration of this show will mostly be focused on the concept of intersectionality in kind of the popular and activist concept. Because, obviously I'm not a legal expert. That's you, Pascal. So you'll have to fill in the gaps there. And obviously I have some criticisms of intersectionality as a framework. But before I, sort of launch into those, I guess I do want to just take a moment to acknowledge that, if we're talking about intersectionality to just mean that people can experience multiple types of oppression at the same time, and that these oppressions can often exacerbate or compound each other, like, I don't disagree with that. And I don't think that most people would disagree with that. I mean, I think that that's relatively uncontroversial. And, following from that, I also think that at best, intersectionality as kind of like a vague term can sometimes be a sort of useful rhetorical intervention against these overly broad identity categories like women or Black people that aren't really coherent, right? Or are not automatically political constituencies in and of themselves. And the way I think intersectionality or like intersectionality as a rhetorical device kind of does this is it sort of foregrounds the fact that we all have different identities, right? And everybody in a kind of category like women or Black people is going to have different experiences sort of based on gender, sexual orientation, or of course your class position. And on the last note, I don't think that that's terribly different from what people like, for example, the great Adolph Reed often point out when they want to sort of problematize this idea of a monolithic Black community, right? So I'll just start off by saying that. Now, all of that said, I think that my main criticism of the intersectionality framework is that it really treats class as just another vector of oppression, like racism or sexism, right? So under the intersectionality framework, for example, if you are a low-income Black woman, intersectionality would say you are oppressed by race, you're oppressed because of your gender, and also by class. And I think that kind of misconstrues class, because class isn't really a type of oppression or a type of discrimination. It's a relation. So if you're a Marxist, you believe that your class is determined by your relationship to production, aka if you have to work for a living, that is, sell your labor power to survive, you produce surplus value, which a capitalist captures as profit. And that process is exploitation, not oppression. And so I think that my main problem with intersectionality, as I was saying, is that when it construes class as just another type of oppression that an individual can experience, it really turns this problem of exploitation into a problem of classism. And of course, when you're focused on classism rather than capitalism, I think that leads you to some bad solutions, right? Because attacking classism rather than attacking capitalism is really about changing the way that people think and how they talk and how they treat poor people or think about poor people, right? And it's not really about fundamentally changing the economy. So I guess maybe I'll wrap up there and get your guys' thoughts. But I also want to say that at its very worst, especially among liberals, I think that the intersectionality framework sort of becomes an opportunity for people to like kind of check off a laundry list of like the oppressions that they know about, right? Or like just allows them an opportunity to like signal that they know the right combination of words, and or that they know how to like identify the most marginalized person in a room or something. And I was talking with Jason about this earlier today. There was an article that came out in The Nation a few years ago in 2020 that posited that Elizabeth Warren was the first unapologetically intersectional candidate. And I can see Jason like rolling his eyes already. And
I sent it to you, Pascal, because I sent Jen. So it was almost like we were trying to have an eye roll off. So someone had mentioned so I made an intro video for this show. I don't know if you got a chance to watch it, Jen. Did you get a chance to see it?
I did. Yeah.
And in it, someone said, I hope you mentioned, and I can't remember the professor's name. I never heard of the person. So I looked him up and I was reading one of his papers. And I sent it to you, Pascal, and you replied to it with the same thing I said when I started looking over it. Like, this is the most PMC nonsense I've ever read in my life. And Jen was like, oh, I thought we were going to talk more about this. And she sends me this Nation article where it talks about how Elizabeth Warren basically can mention that all these groups are oppressed. And that's kind of where it stopped. Like, she's not.
I mean, this article literally was like, Elizabeth Warren is the most intersectional presidential candidate there ever has been, because she wrote a medium.com article titled How We Value the Work of Black Women. Like, that to me is kind of the epitome of this sort of like I said, laundry list, kind of like name checking, signaling version of intersectionality.
Well, doesn't Hillary Clinton, when she's running in 2016, and I felt like the 2016 election was a very pivotal election, and we both of our shows talk about this moment because it is kind of an important moment for this new burgeoning left that we see. And I do think the main candidates in that election are kind of important people for the way we even view politics still. And Hillary Clinton had done something in that election that started to change the tide, as did Black Lives Matter, which was they racialized these public goods programs that people like Bernie Sanders were bringing forward. So Hillary Clinton was like, look, you can relieve student debt all you want, but it's not going to make racism go away. It's not going to make sexism go away.
Yeah,
right. Breaking up the banks won't end racism.
He's trying to raise my ire, and he's doing a very good job. I'm bringing that up.
There you go. Go for it.
I want to talk about that. We're going to get there. But you said a lot in your oeuvre, Jen, and I really liked the way you addressed my question. But I'm going to be even more cynical and circumspect than you are, because I look at as you probably know, on our show we have the theme that we have on our show, the 50+ year counter-revolution, which as you are aware of, and basically our theory is that politics after the rise of the new left, and particularly the flashpoint 68 up until this point, has been a counter-revolution against the New Deal Civil Rights Coalition that comes about in that era as an attempt to retrench against even the modicum of the public goods and racial progress that was done at that time, even though for us who are more on the kind of dialectical materialist left, I think many of us would say that the new left exactly kind of gets more love than it deserves, and there are other periods in American kind of radical left history that were more productive for working class people. I think you might be among those folks who agree with us in that analysis as well. But nonetheless, because of even the reactionary nature of American politics, there was a counter-revolution against what we got out of the New Deal Civil Rights Coalition. The way I look at intersectionality and critical race theory, particularly because I am kind of old enough to remember when they were floated as ideological projects coming out of the period of postmodernism in academia, when it's actually an attempt to remove Marxism or dialectical materialism from higher education. We're moving also into a period where the Soviet Union is losing its power in the world, and we're starting to move closer and closer towards that end of history kind of period where it almost becomes a fait accompli that we assume that capitalism is going to be, international capitalism is the means of production of the world. Black elites who are now more saturated in institutions of the professional managerial class than they had been at any time before. They're at elite universities, they're at corporations, and they're of various levels of government management in municipal areas. We're realizing that their ability to leverage racial democracy or race-based remedies that they had been able to receive from the close of the civil rights movement up until the 80s was losing popularity and had been losing popularity really since the rise of the Bakke decision in the Supreme Court in the 70s. And the way I look at the attempts of critical race theory and intersectionality, it's a realization to that crisis in the consciousness of Black elites of how exactly they're going to need to rebrand their attempt to validate racial democracy in lieu of the fact that there has been no real redistributive agenda to poor and working class Blacks, forces in an attempt to use theories within the panoply of this newly burgeoning postmodernism to reify a justification of a quote-unquote special type of oppression. And what you get is the rise of things like critical race theory and intersectionality that basically posits that even though their position as elites has proliferated to greater levels than have ever been in American society, that the permanence of racism is here and has not changed, and that things are the same as they ever were. And as a result, what we need is more basically diversity, equity, and inclusion, because since they are not materialists or they don't challenge capitalism, none of them ask for any kind of redistribution at all. And at best, what they're asking for is to literally produce more Derek Bells and more Kimberly Crenshaws and more Barack Obamas, as opposed to actually realizing that that's part of the problem instead of redistributing the wealth that we have in this country so that it goes to working class and poor Black folk.
I think that's really well said, and I feel like something that actually really underscores that really well is, as I mentioned earlier, looking at the original court case that is sort of the foundation that Kimberle Crenshaw based intersectionality theory on. Pascal, you probably know it. It's called Degraff and Reed versus General Motors. And I think the popular understanding of the case is, in 1976, 5 Black women sued General Motors for discrimination, and their case was tossed out because a judge found that General Motors had not discriminated against women and had not discriminated against Black people. And what Kimberle Crenshaw says is the law just couldn't recognize that these women, by virtue of being Black women, were experiencing the intersection of these two different types of discrimination, right? So that's kind of the popular gloss of the case. And I think that what people don't always talk about, which goes back to much of what you were speaking about, Pascal, is that part of these women's lawsuit was actually challenging a last hired, first fired seniority layoff policy that General Motors had in place because of a collective bargaining agreement with the union. So I want to unpack that a little bit because I think it speaks to some of the shortcomings of the intersectionality framework.
Sure, go ahead.
So, of course, when you look at the case from an intersectionality framework, that really just focuses on the identities of the plaintiffs, as we've been talking about. And I think that it really misses 2 things. Number one, why was General Motors laying off people to begin with, right? Yep. So, like I say, this is the end of the 70s. So this obviously comes after a wave of strikes and a wave of, labor actions taken by the UAW in the 1970s, where a lot of workers are pushing back against speed up, which is happening because General Motors wants to stay competitive with foreign imports and changes in the auto industry. So they're really cracking down on workers, trying to shave down labor costs, obviously, as usual, trying to maximize profit. And I mean, we all know the story of what happened to the auto industry, right? So I think, Jason, in your intro video to Intersectionality, you said something like, is this just rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic? I think in the case of the GM layoffs, like, we know what happened. We know that GM was the Titanic. It sank, right? So that's something that the intersectionality framework misses, I think, right off the bat, or doesn't have the capacity to foreground. Why was GM doing these layoffs to begin with? That is a larger economic and structural issue that I think, as I said, the intersectionality framework, which focuses just on the identities of these plaintiffs, really just glosses over or can't even account for. And I also want to point out that this thing that I mentioned about how the case was not just about discrimination, but also about a policy of seniority, which was in the collective bargaining contract established by the union. Like, seniority is an incredibly important workplace right, and it is so interesting to me that this was the case that was chosen to illustrate discrimination, because I think that it is true. So what these women claimed was that they had actually been hired by GM, but they were the first to be fired, and when the company was conducting layoffs, and they claimed that this was because GM just hadn't hired any Black women prior to like 1960 or whatever. So their argument was that the seniority policy was kind of continuing this legacy of discrimination. And I think that there is an element of truth to that. But as I said before, seniority is an incredibly important workplace right. It's the bedrock of like any good union contract, along with just cause. And the reason for that is because seniority is one of the like few objective criteria that exists in a workplace, right? When you don't have seniority rules in place, then management has even more discretion to hire and fire who they want at will. And obviously, when it comes time for layoffs, management is always going to want to fire the people who are actually most senior, because those are the people who get paid the most, have the best benefits, and probably have the deepest ties to the union. So I just wanted to like throw out those sorts of those points in this discussion, just to complement what you said, Pascal, because I think that to me it it's just so telling of the fact that you ignore all of these underlying structural economic conditions. The GM case happens at the beginning of deindustrialization, right? So the economy is basically starting to contract, middle class, good jobs are disappearing. And yet you have this framework that says, well, what we need to do is make sure that no one's discriminating, even though these jobs are disappearing. That to me is the epitome of rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic.
Well, everyone, that is why she is known here on This Is Revolution as not just Jin Pan, but Hotep Jin Pan.
Here it comes!
I mean, you kind of killed it on
jokes today. Abundantly, the jokes are everywhere.
I mean, Jen, you kind of killed it on that, Jen. Were you ready for this show? I mean,
I did send you that Nation article, right? No, I mean, the reason why I actually know one or two things about the GM case is because I think it's really interesting. And I mean, I don't know, Pascal, do you know more about it? This is just clearly a layperson's perspective.
No. I mean, I've been dubious of the whole intersectional argument. First of all, I think the framework, I've always believed that the whole issue with intersectionality was that really was rooted in an attempt to create a special suspect classification for Black women, differentiated from black men, based on the premise and the argument that Crenshaw was making, that Black women suffer from racism more than Black men. I think that's a spurious claim, not because it's true or false. I think that having some type of gender-based war between Black men and Black women on who suffers from racism more is probably one of the sickest things that I've ever heard in my life. And I've been profoundly contemptuous of this whole intersectional framing, because frankly, what I realize is that there is a materiality to the way in which racism affects Black men and Black women, and they are affected adversely in different ways, and it is definitely gendered, and I don't deny that.
Mm-hmm.
But because of the way in which men have a higher proclivity to physically replicate the harms of being relegated to labor redundancy, i.e., crime, drug addiction, things of that nature, there is a more physical way in which capitalism and the state deals with the labor obsolescence of males than women. And that way is police, incarceration, and various other social ills that basically house them in state carceral apparatus at a higher rate than women. And that's cross-racial. And one of the problems I had with the intersectional framework is that it failed to understand that race and class and gender are different ways in which people are oppressed, but it doesn't mean that one's oppression is more valuable than the others or more respected than the others, even within the same race. Not even outside, not even talking about going just outside with other ethnic groups or quote unquote race, because there is only one race, the human race, but other ethnic groups, but even within one. So I've always found this very problematic, and it does not surprise me that in the age of Black girl magic, trust Black women, and in a time in which, because the material consequences of Black men being disproportionately relegated to lumpen status as well as proletarianized and incarcerated as well, that the state and capital are recruiting Black women into the apparatuses of state management in a way that is demonstrated, particularly in the Democratic Party, through these slogans, not so much because they respect Black women, not so much because they realize that Black women are capable, it's because they realize that Black women can be paid less than other ethnic groups for doing the same task that white women or white men can do, and they'll be more than willing to do, though, because they will be basing their willingness to do so under the claim that they have been excluded historically. So what I'm saying is, when I look at people like Kamala Harris, when I look at the rise of Black female sheriffs and police, what I'm saying is that capitalism is basically incorporating Black women into the ruling class apparatus of governance and policing of the poor and working class on the cheap, because it realizes it can use intersectional frameworks to say, sister, we've denied you all this time. Now it's your time to shine, because we know that Black women, the Black men ain't going to be able to do the job. And as a result, Black women are being incorporated into an apparatus of social management and control of not only their own communities, but their overall community, still at a lower economic paradigm than they normally would have anyway. So I don't see it serving them, and I think it's just simply a way of recruiting them into the hierarchies of capital. And I think the person that was the most eloquent in saying this was Joy James. When we had her on the show, we were talking about with the I don't know if you watched the interview we did with her on the Real News Network, but she's a Black feminist scholar. She was like, yo, man, all of this Black girl magic stuff is recruiting Black women to be basically operators of the Death Star.
Well, I mean, you see it, like, I don't know if you guys see it. I live in Mexico now, since we last talked, Jen. So
oh, I know, Jason. I know all about it. No, you told me. Okay. But anyway, go on.
Scared the shit out of me. And there are more and more women of color that I see as border guards. There's more and more women of color that I see as police officers, even when I was in Oakland. So I agree with you wholeheartedly, Pascal. I think you're 100% right. That's the one thing this is doing is allowing more and more women of color to be a part of the ruling class apparatus, especially in places like law enforcement, because now you're talking about a government job with benefits. And if you're in law enforcement, where I'm from in the Bay Area, you're walking in the door at six figures.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah. And you're thinking about it now, you're like, oh, damn.
Yeah, like, oh, you say they're hiring women of color? No, I'm just kidding.
Well, I mean, we had a woman on the show a few weeks ago that was for years a counselor, a drug counselor for the unhoused as well. And she had friends that left to join law enforcement.
Right.
because they were looking for people that had experience dealing with drug addicted homeless people. So there's a huge difference from actually working to better people's lives, making maybe $20 an hour, maybe $25 an hour. You don't make much money when you're working in services.
Right.
To making literally 100,000, and now you got a pension.
Right.
Oh, I mean, it's night and day. It's exactly.
Well, Jen, I want to ask you more kind of atmospheric questions.
Yeah.
How, and this is something I'm being serious now.
Well, can I ask this question before you ask your question, Pascal?
Do you have another question, Jason?
I do. I had the first question, and you skipped over my question. You brought right into your question, and I had a whole monologue. I throw the monologue out. So my feelings are hurt.
Well, I'm trying to make it easier for you because I know you're sick. That's the only reason.
I am sick, but still, I still wrote a monologue.
Jason, do your monologue.
It's like John Elway playing on a bum knee. But it's too late. I can't do the monologue, Jim Pan. But I did find this academic article getting ready for this show a few days ago. I sent it to Pascal by a woman named Barbara Foley. She wrote it in like 2019.
Yeah.
I
know that article is good. Yeah.
Okay. She says, while Crenshaw's model ably describes the working of what the African-American feminist writer Patricia Hill Collins has termed a matrix of oppressions, the model's spatial two-dimensional points to its inadequacy as an explanation of why this matrix exists in the first place. Who created the avenues? Why would certain people be traveling down them? Where were they constructed and when? Jen and Pascal, do you view intersectionality much like anti-racism as the left wing of neoliberalism?
Ooh,
Pascal already basically said yes.
That's some hot lead for the interwebs, bro. I think yes. I think it's a rad lib. I think it's what the cool kids call a rad lib proposition. It's liberal in nature, but it doesn't really address the distributive problems of capitalism in any way. And at best, it really requests diversity, inclusion, and equity into the system that's already shrinking, and the pie is already, basically just rearranging the deck chairs.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I essentially agree with that, and I also want to point out I really like that Barbara Foley article because at another point she says something like, "Well, intersectionality can be useful as a way of describing how multiple oppressions affect people," which is something that I was kind of like alluding to earlier, but it doesn't offer any kind of explanation for what generates or sustains not just these different types of oppression, but what creates these identities, right? So I do think that intersectionality very often sort of treats identities like racial or gender identities as a given, as the starting point, and does not interrogate what constitutes those identities historically.
That's a very good question and a good point. I wanted to ask, it follows with a question I wanted to ask you is that, do you think that one of the problems with intersectionality is that it essentializes otherized identities, such as race, gender, so on and so forth?
Yeah, I mean, I do think so, again, because I do not feel like the framework offers an adequate explanation for how these identities are constituted historically. And, as I mentioned earlier, I do want to repeat that I think, when people sort of invoke intersectionality as a way to kind of disrupt coherent notions of identity, like disrupt the idea of like a cohesive Black community, I think it can be kind of useful. But at the end of the day, as we've been talking about, it has all of these other shortcomings as well. So I don't know. Do you see any of those like sort of positive aspects to using intersectionality as kind of like a rhetorical intervention? Because I know you're skeptical, but
I'll be very honest with you. I think that one of the phenomenon that I have seen in the post-Obama millennium that has made me very, very, very dubious of all of this is the incorporation of academic foundation speak into mainstream American politics in a way that I don't remember seeing at any other period of time. Quite frankly, I actually think that's because so much of social media, particularly Twitter, is saturated with academics and journalists.
Yeah.
And there is a nexus between the way academics and journalists come together because they all are influenced by the foundation world at some point, or the other, or they all can spend time being financed by the
Mhm.
foundation world. And I think that this type of discourse is ripe for being bankrolled for the foundation world because it does nothing to challenge capital and it
Mhm.
creates discourse without dissection of the problem.
Mhm. So that's actually exactly why I brought up the Nation article that called Elizabeth Warren like the best intersectional candidate that we have, because their reasoning was basically that she uses the right combination of words, right? I mean, the article is like
She's a
a few
trans
thousand.
advocate.
She is an advocate of marginalized,
Yeah.
trans, queer, Black
Yeah, she
women.
had a-
You
she
know,
had a
like
big
she
time
just
trans
she
advocate.
knows the foundation speak, as you pointed out. And to this author, that was evidence of her like intersectional credibility. And I think that, as we know very well from the way that Elizabeth Warren's campaign went, it's not only insidious insofar as it kind of creates an opportunity to be bankrolled by foundations, but it just doesn't resonate with 99% of the US population.
Well, is the solution then to intersectionality? I should say the solution, but I feel like their solutions are just inclusion. And I went down a bit of a Jin Pan rabbit hole, getting ready for this show. Hey, you're all over the internet, homegirl.
Well, I mean, I don't know if you found this out, Jason. Somebody with my exact name killed her entire family. That's not me, by the way.
I did
She's all
find
over
that
the
out.
internet.
I did find that out. And the first time you were on the show, side note, I found that out because I was looking for
Okay,
pictures
yeah.
of you. And
You're
I was
like,
like,
damn,
I was looking for a
who's
bio for you. And I
yeah.
was like, that's not the same woman I think. That's on, I mean, she's
I've
Asian.
really turned my life around. No, I'm just kidding. That's not
So I
me.
watched the documentary on her, by the way.
Okay, all right,
It is
yeah.
very interesting. The other
Yeah.
Jim Pan. And then there's another woman that's a professor.
Yeah. I hope people aren't mad at her thinking that she's me.
None
but
of you people look anything alike, by the way.
well, that doesn't always count.
I can imagine the hate mail you get. It must be really cool.
Oh, me personally? I mean, I'm not on social media, so it's
She's
all
not-
kind of
she's-
like,
yeah.
I don't know, if people are like raging about something I say, it's fine.
Oh, you're actually intentionally not on social media?
Yeah, I don't know. Twitter seems stressful.
It is.
Oh, Twitter is pretty horrible.
But you did a show on when Crazy Rich Asians came out with the
Yes.
homie Paul Prescott, and Kale Brooks is in the chat, so shout out to Kale.
Oh, yeah.
And you were talking about Crazy Rich Asians, and I remember when that came out because my daughter had read the books. She is not a crazy rich, she is Asian, and just wanted to get it because it said Asian on it, and I found that interesting because as we were getting ready for this show and I was watching your inclusion episode, I thought, well, is this kind of the solution? This is kind of what Pascal's been hitting at, what you guys are saying, is that we'll give you representation if that's really what you want, and you'll see it in media now. And that's how you know you get a win, right? So George Floyd protests, everybody burns down a police station and a Walmart, then you get every streaming service has Black movies for Black people.
They did that for Asians last month, by the way.
When you guys were getting hit, when people were hitting Asian people all over the head.
I think a little bit of that, but like last month was Asian month, so like suddenly all of the streaming services were like, here's a vertical where you can watch like Rashomon and also Aquaman,
Last month was
Asian month,
and
Pascal, come on.
Amy Tan's Joy Luck Club.
That's right, yeah.
Which was required reading for me in Albany High.
Or is that true? You're being facetious, obviously, right?
No, last month, Pascal, last month was Asian American Pacific Islander month.
Yeah.
But they just, okay. I'm not saying you're wrong. They just created that. They just created that, though, right?
I think Reagan created it.
AAPI month has been around for like a long time.
I don't think they call it AAPI.
Wow. Yeah.
Somebody look this up, but I think Reagan did it.
Sudeep said, "You mean it's a month?" Yes, Sudeep.
Oh yeah, you're right. Sorry. Yeah. Sorry, Sudeep. Yeah, it's still our month.
It's not your Asians though. It's only the Jin Pan Asians.
You know why? Because let me tell you, May is also Haitian Heritage Month.
And is it?
I've been like
Haitian and Asian.
Hey, there you go. That could make for some really interesting spicy food.
Right.
But yeah, I felt that.
All right, Jason, what were you saying about Crazy Rich Asians?
I tried to watch it. I couldn't get into it.
Yeah.
and I'm going to watch Shang-Chi. The
Oh,
Marvel.
that's the like Asian Marvel.
Yes.
Yeah, well, this is the last day of the month to watch it, so.
Oh, yeah. I'm totally going to do that. And then call all my kids and be like, hey, happy month.
Yeah,
We're
happy month.
But that was just a way for initially when Marvel was rolling out the character in the 70s,
Mhm.
it was a way for them to cash in on the Bruce Lee phenomenon.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Much
yeah.
like Luke Cage for them in the 70s was a way
Mhm.
for them to cash in on the blaxploitation cinema phenomenon.
Mhm.
So these are always just cash-ins. It isn't like, Stan Lee sat around and was like, you know what we need? More Asian inclusion because I love my yellow brothers. Like that wasn't part of his plan. And Marvel wanted to do it because they felt like there was a huge
Mhm.
market in China where their movies
Right.
weren't being seen as much.
But even if like Stan Lee was the wokest person on earth and was like, we really need more Asian representation so like Asian people can see themselves as superheroes and feel good about themselves, like I don't think that really helps the vast majority of working Asian American people who are like worried about like getting their next paycheck,
But you see yourself on the screen, no?
Right, yeah, that's better. That's better than any.
It's better than anything. Well, Stan Lee, originally Black Panther was created before the Black Panthers. And when the Black Panthers came to be, there was a bit of a backlash. So there was a few years where they changed his name to Leopard Man.
Oh.
And it did not stick, and they changed it back to Black Panther.
Yeah, Black Panther's better.
Naomi Osaka is both Haitian and Asian. Thank you for letting me.
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
Yeah, she's Haitian and Asian, Pascal.
So May was like definitely her.
No, for her, well, Naomi Osaka's house would have been on fleek.
Right.
Because her parents are still together, right?
They are still
they?
together, I believe. Yes.
She's kind of the poster girl for everything we're talking about right now because she also didn't she not play in a tournament because of mental illness?
She had an emotional kind of
right.
It's really interesting, Jason. You brought up something that you said Catherine and Lou was working on our show. I really like Catherine Lou's work.
Love her.
Bust her out now. This is
the kind of marketing of trauma
in
the contemporary moment and how people kind of advertise their trauma. And I'm not trying to argue that what Naomi Osaka was going through was not illegitimate. I'm sure she was going through some kind of emotional difficulty, and I'm sure it was legitimate. But it does seem like in this contemporary moment, people wear their trauma on their sleeve as if it's like a badge of like, of celebrities. It's like, yes, I'm going through all of this trauma. And I'm just like, why aren't people more private about their difficulties anymore?
Yeah. I mean, it's funny. I think it's not entirely unrelated to the intersectionality conversation because, as I'm sure you guys have noticed many, many times, often in kind of like activism or like left media and journalism spaces, people will sort of trot out their list of identities. Like, I'm a, queer Asian American, like first generation disabled, like, I don't know, non-binary individual. In order to kind of establish their, interpretive authority over a given subject.
No, to give them legitimacy. You're being
right,
confined.
exactly.
To give them legitimacy as a XYZ, YZ, ABC woman, man, person who lived in the XYZ for XYZ years, I think my ability to choose what type of syrup for this pancake is the best is much more effective than you.
Exactly. Yeah.
Well, doesn't that just turn everything, and this is how I feel about intersectionality, it just turns everything into the oppression Olympics because you're just trying to figure out the hierarchy of who's more oppressed, because ultimately it really is a matrix. I watched a fair share of Kimberly Crenshaw videos to get ready for this, and I've watched some before because she was a kind of a big deal. Again, 2016 is an important year because as people are learning about the left and we're finally watching political shows and commentary and watching academic conferences, right? I mean, those things didn't have a lot of views beforehand. It's names like Kimberly Crenshaw. Who was she a student of Derek Bell, Pascal?
Yes, yes. I do
Okay,
believe
that
that.
makes
Absolutely
Yeah.
correct.
So she's literally comes out of critical race theory. You know, Adolph Reed has an article about anti-racism where he says in 1991 he went to go see Derek Bell speak, and he says Derek Bell starts off his speech by saying nothing has changed for Black people
Right.
since 1865. And Derek Bell says it's in 1991. Would Derek Bell like to go back to 1865?
Well, you know, actually, you know what Adolph Reed says? It's just like, yeah, that would be funny, except that if you were back in 1865, you'd be standing here with a broom in your hand.
Oh my God.
So it's kind of insane. And,
Yeah.
and he even talks about it in the piece where he's like, I get what he's trying to say. This is a way to, you know, rile people up, and it's definitely used in activist circles. But I've just never found a useful value for trying to have some sort of matrix of oppression,
Right.
so we can see who's oppressed more, and then what? My question is always, all right, so that person right there is the most oppressed out of everybody in the room. Then what?
Right.
What are we
Right.
supposed to do now?
Yeah. Right. Right. Yeah, I mean, I just want to add on to that, like exactly what you said. It kind of leads toward cataloging the various identities and finding out who the most oppressed or most marginalized person is, and that kind of becomes, I mean, that's like a moral position, right? Like finding out who is like the most disenfranchised or the most oppressed out of all of us. But it's really bad strategically. And I mean, I think that Vivek Chibber is the one who has the best line on this. Like, why do we focus on the working class? We focus on the working class not because it's marginal, but because it's central to capitalism. And the working class is basically, I think he puts it, the goose that gets the golden egg, right? Like everything will stop without the working class. The working class is in a position of strategic power. And that's why we want to organize as the working class. Finding out who the most marginalized person is, like I said, is kind of like a way of, I don't know, like checking a box or like showing that you are like sufficiently attentive to everybody's various identities. But I don't think that's a way that you organize politics.
Well,
Not if you want to be effective.
The argument, the reason why we want to actually maintain on otherized identity is because we're still stuck valorizing the framework of race relations that comes out of the 19th century that starts with Booker T. Washington. In other words, we have to have siloed communities that have to be determined in terms of how they relate to the normative white majority so that we can choose interlocutors, so we can literally socially manage the expectations of those political groups. And that's done particularly largely with Black people, not so much with anyone else. But what the ruling class would always like to maintain would be to see if there are other quote unquote ethnic minorities who would like to be socially engineered or managed in a similar kind of way. So, you know, not to be overly cynical again, but my larger position is that one of the reasons why we don't want to talk about people in terms of their labor relation to capital or their place in political economy, whether it be the proletariat, working class, lumpen proletariat, the bourgeoisie, the petit bourgeois, whatever they are, is because we need to find a way to justify the race relations framework or the relational framework that maintains elites being brokers for people that they do not materially have in common with in terms of their quality of life, but because they somatically look like them, they can be used to represent them to a ruling class who uses those brokers to reify their own agenda, as opposed to serving those communities that are supposed to be represented by those brokers.
Well, Sudeep brought up Claudia Jones, and this is one of those situations where we actually had a good conversation with a year or so ago with Sharice Burton-Stelly. She actually will forget more about Black female Marxists than I'll ever learn.
No doubt.
She had some good takes on Claudia Jones.
Right, she talked about how Claudia Jones had the idea of triple oppression, and how it would. She basically saying that was a more effective. I think she was arguing that was a more effective way of addressing the way in which women in certain spaces were being affected by capital exploitation more so than simply using intersectionality. And I think she did concede that intersectionality in its current framework was a petit bourgeois kind of liberal mechanism. But I would dare not even want to put my words in her mouth by stretching the imagination. She would be much more effective.
Yeah, because she listened to the show, and that's the last thing we want to get is a fire-ass tweet from Sharice Burton-Stelly. Fucking, I didn't
I'll
say
check
that,
that out.
Pascal.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Sassy ass tweet. Oh, somebody said, Pascal, you still got some more questions you want to ask?
Yeah, so another reason I wanted when I was said the question I had that was atmospherics.
Yes.
How can, and this is serious. I mean, I know you might think that I'm being playful, Jen, but I'm being serious.
Okay.
How can we on the left,
Mhm.
or real dialectical materialist leftists, if you want to say Marxist, whatever we want to call, how can we point out the shortcomings of these radical liberal ideas without seeming insensitive to the fact that people of various ethnic groups do suffer discrimination,
Right.
and are actually harmed by oppression
Mhm.
and wealth extraction under capitalism,
Right.
and that there is a material reality to the way capitalism racializes and otherizes communities in its extraction. You would not deny that it is true
Right.
today.
Yeah. Yeah, right. And I mean, I think to go back to something that we were sort of getting at earlier, to me, one of the most insidious things about the intersectionality framework, especially when it's used by, these kind of like nation liberals, is that it's used to demonize universalist programs, right? And to say that like the Bernie Sanders platform, or like, I want to read a line from that Nation article. I wrote it down because it was like so crazy. She writes, let me find it. She writes, about this is the Elizabeth Warren one. She writes, as much as I want Medicare for all and for the rich to pay higher taxes, that won't cure sexism. Warren gets that. And, we were talking about Hillary Clinton uttering those same lines before earlier. And so that's all to say that, like, the thing I really don't like about, the way that intersectionality is deployed in this context is that it, as I said, it demonizes universalist programs, and it sort of posits that the more radical thing is to like find these highly particularist policies, that like specifically target like the most marginalized among us or something like that. And I think the way to combat that is to do the thing that Adolf Reed always does, which is to say, like, let's take something like Medicare for all. If you want to use the word intersectional, how is that not intersectional? Medicare for all would disproportionately benefit Black people, disproportionately benefit women, disproportionately benefit Black women. Same thing with something like a minimum wage increase, right? Like, who are the people who are most likely to be working low wage jobs in the service sector,
Women
or
of
as
color.
domestic workers? Women of color.
Yep.
So, I think that a way of kind of acknowledging, a way of both pushing against the intersectionality framework, and especially when it's used to demonize universalist programs, and also acknowledging that people face, as we've said many times on the show, a multitude of oppressions, is to be like, how are these programs not intersectional?
Well, Jen, I want to ask you, and I'm not trying to put you on the spot, and because you may disagree.
Okay.
Because the reason why I want to ask you is because I know that there are many people who go with the trope that leftists or Marxists or dialectical materialists or class reductionists, they don't believe that racism matters or exists, and they don't believe that it exists. They don't. Do you agree that in a capitalist society, there is a particular way of otherization of marginalized communities that reduces them perhaps disproportionately to lumping or surplus redundant labor that has adverse harms that can be somewhat called, quote unquote, racialized?
I would agree, but I would also say that I think that that is changing under neoliberalism, right? So I think that, the problem with saying that capitalism is just like always and forever racist is that then you kind of get into the territory where you start to, it starts to seem like if you challenge racism, you're automatically challenging capitalism. Like if those
Right.
things
No,
are
I
really
wouldn't go that far.
inextricably
I mean,
okay, right. So so I would say that, one of the most insidious things about neoliberalism is the way in which I think it is able to kind of like embrace and deploy multiculturalism, right? I mean, I feel like, I mean, this is like Walter Ben Michael's whole thing, right? Like neoliberalism just needs a surplus population. It doesn't really care who's in that surplus
Thank you.
population.
It does not care. And
So that goes hand in
anti-racism-
hand with like diversifying the ruling class, right? Like,
Yeah. I mean, ultimately, anti-racism and intersectionality kind of also come down to the same thing about the evil of white men. It's all
Right,
the
and
evil of white men.
I would agree that historically, the way that capitalists have sort of justified who's in the surplus population and the way that capitalists have divided the working class is to utilize these sort of like racialized identities. But I really do think that that is changing.
Well, I would argue that under neoliberalism, there's been even more of an extreme way in which that it has increased more blacks at the top, but actually cannibalized not necessarily larger numbers, but persistent numbers of blacks at the bottom, particularly with things like mass incarceration, where those numbers are still disproportionate, but it still doesn't change the fact that disproportionality is required within a capitalist system where you have racial disproportionate numbers of population anyway. Because in other words, what I'm saying is that if you had whites that were being mass incarcerated at the same rates as blacks or Latinos, they would rebel. They would not tolerate that. I don't think they would tolerate the same rates of carcerality being applied to them.
I don't agree.
But Pascal, most people in prison are white. They're disproportionately black, but the majority are white.
There's hella white people in prison. I'll take you to some places. I'll take you to some prison towns where majority of people locked up are white. They ain't rebelling shit.
I would not deny that there are many prison towns where the majority of white people are white. But the thing is, though, the rate of incarceration but in populations where you have black and white people,
right, totally,
the rate of incarceration is not the same at all.
Right. No, I agree. But I'm saying that, I wonder. I mean, like, by that logic, like, shouldn't black people be rebelling if
I think there's a socialization of accepting that you would be otherized.
I'll go even further. I think that first of all, if you go back to the 90s and 80s, there were bad people, and there's a lot of people in the black community that wanted those bad people, quote unquote, to go to jail for
sure. We know that.
And the same thing happens in predominantly white communities.
Yeah.
If you have a poor area of town and the poor people, because again, police's main function is police poverty.
Mm-hmm.
If you're policing the poor people in town and you're locking them motherfuckers up left and right, they're not trying to riot. It just is what it is.
First of all, the ultimate function of police is to punish the poor. Mm-hmm. Period. Regardless of what color they are, is to punish the poor. But again, there's also a proportionality to that punishment, sadly.
So, I mean, same thing with Latin neighborhoods, right? When I cross the border, I'm seeing a lot of women brown and a lot of dudes that are brown. It ain't a bunch of white people. White supremacy ain't pulling over their Latin brothers crossing the border to the States. It's people that live in these smaller cities, these border towns, because again, these are, like Pascal said before, these are the jobs that are actually paying. So when it comes down to like incarceration numbers, you go to places like National City, Chula Vista, you're going to see a lot more Latin people incarcerated. When we talk about incarceration, the thing that kind of frustrates me is we always talk about incarceration. We don't talk about immigration incarceration.
That's a big problem.
Civil incarceration, because it's civil, where they can just hold your ass and not tell your goddamn family. So when you look at those numbers, those are the cats. That is the huge surplus army of labor that is being incarcerated more than any ethnic group. Mm-hmm. And they just don't get talked about because it's not part of the conversation that gets the clicks, because people love talking about black, white, race issues. Mm-hmm. And when you add in the brown issue, then it becomes an immigration issue, and that makes people very, very uncomfortable, because immigration is another way to drive down wages and has been since the beginning, since we've been drawing these imaginary lines.
I do take your point, Pascal, and I'm not trying to argue that neoliberalism is like totally colorblind, or that capital and capitalists aren't able to find a way to like use racism to continue to try to divide workers or, I don't know, justify a surplus population. But I do think that there is something about neoliberalism that is like different from prior forms of capitalism, where it's like, we're okay with the diverse ruling class, and we also like want to make the surplus population a little bit more diverse as well. And I think that I don't know, I just find it a really insidious thing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
No, I don't disagree with that, because I think that one of the things that neoliberalism does is that it demonstrates that you can get black people to cheerlead a form of economy that's destroying them, as long as you have black people at the top that look like
Right.
them, that are telling them
Right.
they're succeeding,
Right.
which makes it even more insidious.
Right.
Hey,
Because there was a time where if you didn't have black people at the top, they would be protesting that economy. But because the ruling class is viewed as diverse now, people are going to tell you, oh, why are you complaining? It's only those white people who care about things like Medicare for all.
Right. Right.
Born Center says we're okay with billionaires if they're black. That is hilarious. And on that note, I want to thank Jin Pan for agreeing to come on the show. Originally, I tried to get you to come on with Dean Robinson some time ago.
That would have been very cool. Yeah, I couldn't make that work, but I did watch that show and it was really interesting. He's very cool.
Dean is dope, man. Dean is a dope cat. We will make that show happen at some point, because Teray had put that whole thing together.
Oh yeah, I know he's the mastermind behind so much of what goes on here.
Yeah, but this relationship between Pascal and I. Actually, you.
Oh.
I wouldn't have known you if it wasn't for. I mean, I knew you from watching you on the internets, but Teray was the one that hooked that up. So, Teray Reed.
He's the mastermind.
Making the
I hope that you enjoyed being on our show.
I did, as always. Thank you so much, guys. Always a pleasure to talk to you, and hope we'll talk soon.
So Jen is going to be joining us in the champagne room. She already said she is. I'm excited.
I am, and by the way, I just want to say the last time I was on the show, you didn't have a champagne room yet, so I have no idea what goes on in there, but I guess I'll head over.
More curse words.
Yeah, great.
More inside jokes on the show. I think we effed around for at least a good 45 minutes teaching you what a hotep was on that first show.
Well, to be continued.
Which is still one of the funniest shits that we did in a long time. So thank you guys so much for joining us. We will be back. Well, not Pascal and I, but tomorrow night, Forrest and Conan will be doing movie night extravaganza right here at 6 p.m. They're going to be discussing Behind the Silver Lake. I forget the name of the movie, but it has something to do with Silver Lake. I tried to watch it one night, and it seemed really interesting. It's like a film noir, a modern film noir, with the guy that played one of the Spider-Mans. So, on that note, we'll see you guys in the champagne room, and we are out.